Can I have your attention? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Kacheni in his capacity as extraordinary professor in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies in the Faculty of the Humanities. I would like to welcome in particular representatives of the rectorate, the top management, academic heads of departments, and all other UFS staff present, as well as members of the public and students. As a university community, we are deeply gratified to count Professor Ndlovu Kacheni, one of the foremost decolonial scholars in the world, as one of our own. In honor of Heritage Month, the Center for Gender and Africa Studies has invited Professor Ndlovu Kacheni to deliver his inaugural lecture titled Mapping the Contours of the Battle of Ideas in African Studies and Delineating the Challenges.
It is a pleasure to welcome, the beautiful sovereign people who are gathered here tonight and those who are online. Allow me to read Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Kacheni's abstract, which underpins, the lecture that he will give, so that you have a clear idea of the map. It reads, African studies as a field continues to be a site of struggles and is haunted by various challenges. The battle of lines of ideas range widely from the reopened basic epistemological questions ignited by the resurgence and insurgence of the decolonization of the 21st century and the insidious positionality of African studies in the global knowledge economy and its uneven intellectual division of labor, the hegemony of the Africanist enterprise, to the contestations over conceptions of African studies. At the center of all this are deep-seated, long-standing, and intersecting historical, existential, material, epistemic, and cognitive justice concerns, which have not yet been resolved adequately. This inaugural lecture performs two major diagnostic tasks. In the first instance, it maps out some of the key contours of the current battle lines of ideas in African studies so as to enlighten the current state of the debates. In the second instance, it delineates 10 challenges that will require attention as the field of African studies continues to grow. These challenges range from the theory empiricism bifurcation, the colonial linguistic encirclement, the chronology and periodization issues, the space-place dialectic, the resilient androcentric tradition, disciplinary fundamentalism, the canon to the hounding colonial library. It concludes the battle lines by providing African studies with the necessary dynamism as they invoke constant epistemological vigilance and reopening of new vistas of intellectual engagements, which ensures the future of African studies on the continent, the global Africa, and indeed in Europe and North America. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Kacheni to the podium.
falls to me, and I'm quite honored to introduce the speaker for tonight, Professor Sabelo J. Ndlovu-Kacheni. He is currently the a professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South, with emphasis on Africa, and vice dean of research in the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. Professor extraordinaire in the Department of Leadership and Transformation in the Principal and Vice Chancellor's Office at the University of South Africa. Professor extraordinarius in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State. Honorary Professor in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Research Associate in the Ali Mazrui Center for Higher Education at the University of Johannesburg, Research Associate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, and Research Associate at the Ferguson Center for African and Asian Studies at the Open University in the United Kingdom. Professor Ndlovu-Kacheni is a prolific author and scholar with 100 publications, including more than 20 books to his name. His latest publications include Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonisation, published by Routledge in 2018, Decolonisation, Development and Knowledge in Africa, Turning Over a New Leaf, published by Routledge in 2020, Marxism and Decolonisation in the 21st Century, Living Theories and True Ideas, published by Routledge in 2022, which was co-edited with Morgan and Ndlovu, and Beyond Coloniality of Internationalism, Reworlding the World from the Global South, which is currently in press with Kadeshria Book Series. Professor Sabelo, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much. Let me begin by observing all the protocols. And let me also express my thanks to the University of the Free State for offering me the professorship. It is indeed my great honor to also deliver this inaugural lecture here during the Heritage Month. And I must say that African knowledges are one of the important heritages that were looted since the time of colonial encounters. This is given expression by the existence of African artworks, sacred ritual materials, and other important artifacts constitutive of what Toyin Falola has termed the ritual archives that are kept in museums and art galleries in Europe. My lecture today will focus on the domain of knowledge in Africa, where various crimes have been committed. And these crimes range from what Jack Goody termed the theft of history, what Ngugi wa Thiong'o depicted as culture sites, linguicides, and a linguifarm, and what Michel Foucault described as subjugated knowledges. I thought of no other topic to address than the contestations and the struggles haunting African studies for various reasons. The first one is that, as you heard here, my professorship is located at the Center of Gender and African Studies. And partly because at the University of Bayreuth, where I'm based currently, I'm Vice Dean for Research in the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose overarching agenda is to reconfigure African studies conceptually and structurally. As you heard also during the introduction, I also hold a chair in epistemologies of the Global South with a emphasis on Africa. So Africa really occupies an important space in my work. I must say I also worked as lecturer in African Studies at the Ferguson Center for African and Asian Studies at the Open University in Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom. I must say that I also received my education in Zimbabwe and built my academic career here in South Africa. Taken together, these experiences enable me to think about African studies from diverse vantage points of Africa and Europe. And these geospatial locations enable particular enunciations of knowledge in general and the conceptions of African studies in particular. If I was based here in Africa, in the universities here in South Africa, sometimes we don't talk very much about African studies because to us it is obvious who are the Africans. It is also obvious that what universities in Africa must do, or African universities must do, must first of all address the African question. But because I'm based somewhere else, the question of what is African studies, who is an African, actually dominates the discussions. And today, unlike the abstract which I sent, which focused on 2 issues, I think let me focus on 4 issues. I want to focus on the context which makes us speak about African studies. I want also to speak about the challenges which are haunting African studies. I want also to speak about the current debates in African studies, and I will end by talking about the future of African studies. So in the first part of the lecture, I deal with those long-standing issues which form a necessary background and a context to the understanding of African studies for African re-existence in general, and those that haunt African knowledge domain in particular. In this section, I will delineate 9 elements of the broader discursive context within which African anti-colonial and decolonial struggles emerged, namely the existential, the historical, the developmental, the reparative, the material, the identitarian, the epistemic, the dignitarian, and the remembering. I will elaborate on these as I move on. In the second part of the lecture, I delineate 10 challenges confronting African studies, namely the genealogical, the epistemic, the linguistic, the chronological, the theoretical, the spatial, the androcentric, the disciplinary, the canonical, and indeed the problem of the colonial library. And I'm focusing on these issues because they pose part of what is our comfort zones. By this I mean the asserted and the reasserted truth or common notions in us doing African studies that have to be changed in accordance with the demands of a decolonized African studies. In the third part of the lecture, I will briefly map out broadly scholarly debates reverberating within and impinging on African studies, which constitute what I've termed in this lecture the battle of ideas. The battle of ideas have become accentuated in the context of the current resurgent and insurgent decolonization of the 21st century. The battle lines, or the battle of ideas, swirl around 6 broad issues, and I will focus on those. The first is the reopened basic epistemological questions and their implications for knowledge in general and African studies in particular. The second is the contestations over the meaning and the implications of colonialism, arising within a context of intensified struggles for decolonization on the one hand, and on the other, the rise of right-wing revisionist discourses in colonialism. And thirdly, I will look at the tensions. Are there any tensions between analysis which focus on race and the analysis which focus on class? And that will take us to the discussion of the intersections of Marxism and the decolonization. And fourthly, I will look at the hegemony of the Africanist enterprise in African studies. And fifthly, I will look at the coloniality of global economy. And I will end with an analysis of the modes of writing about Africa in the 21st century. Then I will conclude this lecture by a reflection on the future of African studies, and I will focus on 4 possibilities. And these possibilities being comparative African studies, critical African studies, frontier African studies, and the global African studies. So allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to go into the context. In the present context, where the agendas, the initiatives, and the struggles for decolonization of knowledge are experiencing a pushback, including being criticized for being wrong-headed, it is important for those who push the agenda of decolonization to actually give context and delineate the key unresolved long-standing issues driving it and impinging on African studies. And we do this so that we circumvent the idea that decolonization, decoloniality is nothing but slogans, is nothing but metaphors. So we will need really to take it upon ourselves to give content and to challenge those who say it is a metaphor, it is a slogan, it is wrong-headed. We need to respond, not by fighting with them physically, but by actually giving the content which actually makes it necessary for us to speak about decolonization of African studies in the 21st century. So the first issue, as I said, I identified 9 of them. They might be more, but I thought of these 9 as the most important, which will give you an overview of why we were still fighting for decolonization and why we are still fighting particularly for decolonization of knowledge. I think the first issue which we need to all reflect on is the existential question for those people who have been reproduced as black, as native, and indigenous. And this existential question speaks to the processes of social classification, racial hierarchization, and the gendering of human population as key technologies of coloniality of being. Here was invented a people whose humanity was questioned, degraded, and even denied. It is within this context where a color line was drawn and some people were defined as a problem in the modern world. This existential challenge provoked Emir Cizé to reflect on what he termed the 3 tormenting questions. Who am I? What are we? Who are we in this anti-black world? With hindsight, we now realize that the questioning of the humanity of other people became an essential justification for carrying out of genocides, colonial conquest, enslavement, and the other inimical colonial and capitalist activities. The questioning of the humanity of other people enabled the construction of what James Blount will call the colonizer's model of the world. And I want to argue that we still live within a world which is framed by colonialism. And within this world, the lives of black people are actually dispensable. And this question is not yet resolved. It feeds into the ongoing Black Lives Matter movements. The second important issue, contextual issue, is the question, the historical question itself. I want to argue that when we speak about African history, we're not speaking about the past. The very idea and the philosophy of history in Africa is not about the past, but about re-emergence and the re-existence of African people against the background of colonialism, which was accompanied by theft of history as part of the broader agenda of denial of humanity. As a result of this, one finds that at the center of knowledge production, there is what Achille Mbembe and Felwine Sarr termed the politics of time, informed by the reality of a people who were expelled from the time of history. At the center of this were and there are initiatives and activities of recovery of the past, not simply as seeking proof of historicity, but as a means to use history to reclaim denied humanity, relocate Africans in the present, and deploy history as a transformative force. This context must enable us to appreciate the works of such scholars as Cheikh Anta Diop, which directly challenged and turned upside down the Hegelian idea in the philosophy of history, which denied the place of Africa in human history. It must also enable us to understand why at the center of negritude movement was the issue of presence Africaine, the presence of Africans in human history. Then the third contextual issue is the developmental question. For a people whose humanity was questioned and denied, there was an argument that they were incapable of engaging in any form of self-improvement. They were considered to be without any ideas of development. They were deemed to be primitive people enveloped by the mantle of darkness. Such a people became candidates for colonial civilizing mission with its attendant violence and brutalities. Here was born a people who were turned into objects of development. Development discourse itself became part of ways of entrenchment of coloniality. This is why there is increasing searches for modes of living and self-improvements that are delinked from racial capitalism and its exploitative practices. What emerged poignantly from this are struggles for self-reliance. And then the next one is the material question. And this one, I put it here for a number of reasons. There is a critique of decoloniality and decolonization that it privileges the epistemic at the expense of the material. It actually privileges the epistemic at the expense of the political economy. I don't think that is true. People who were subjected to racism, enslavement, genocides, colonial conquest, colonial dispossession, displacement, and exploitative racial capitalism became exposed to processes which deliberately sought to destitute, underdevelop, and impoverish them. The survivors today, which is us, exist as providers of cheap labor within a globalized division of labor defined by race, class, and gender. Such a people were severed from their mode of production, and in the process, their very dignity was affected. The other important contextual issue which we need to take into account is the reparative or the restitutive question. This is a justice issue for a people who were affected by inimical processes of which I've already outlined. And the demand for reparations and the restitutive politics point to the damages done through enslavement, colonialism, capitalism, neocolonialism, heteropatriarchal sexism, as systems and structures which were deliberately introduced to destitute Africans. Reparations and restitution are part of the decolonial agenda of reconstitution and remembering. Already, the restitutive struggle is ongoing for recovery and the return of African art and racial artifacts. Then there is the identitarian question. I think a number of you have heard that every time they try to dismiss decolonization and decoloniality, they will tell you this is not about science and the knowledge generation. This is just identitarian politics. The key issue is that of a people who suffered denial of self-definition and were exposed to external definitions and representation by others. What emerged was an imposed identity crisis for a people who underwent a series of inventions and reinventions as deficient subjects. The misrepresentations were backed up using fables, mythologies, and stereotypes. This resulted in colonial forms of governmentality predicated on what Mahmoud Mamdani terms define and rule. Therefore, the struggles of today include fighting for self-definition and the attainment of sovereign selfhood. Then, of course, we have the epistemic question. As long as your humanity is questioned, as long as your humanity is degraded, as long as it is pushed to a sub-human category, it fundamentally translates that you are also said that your knowledge is inferior, is primitive, or At West, you don't even have a knowledge at all. And this becomes very important, particularly for a center like the Center for Gender and African Studies here, because some of the issues are actually very complex. For instance, the reality which emerged from an epistemic question is that the very conceptions of the human and the social, which gave birth to humanities and social sciences, were conceived under Euromodernity against what was considered black and native. And if they were conceived that way, the humanities were conceived that way, if the social sciences were conceived that way, how do we then use them as part of liberatory politics? That is the question. Then there is what I termed here the dignitarian question. The concept of dignitarianism is borrowed from Ali Mazrui, who used it to capture what he termed the experience of lived humiliation for African people who are the most humiliated in modern history. And I will quote what Ali Mazrui says. This is how Ali Mazrui put it. No other groups were subjected to such large-scale indignities of enslavement for several centuries in their millions as the Africans were. No other groups experienced to the same extent such indignities as lynching, systematic segregation, and a well-planned apartheid as the Africans were. It is against this background that Africa's dignitarian impulse was stimulated. A deep-seated African rebellion against humiliation was arose. It has been a misnomer to call this rebellion nationalism. This has not been an African quest for nationhood. At best, nationhood has been just the means to an end. The deep-seated African struggle has been a quest for dignity, human and racial. Then the last contextual issue which I want to outline is what I have called remembering, drawing from the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. One issue for certain which Africans suffered is what Ngugi wa Thiong'o terms dismemberment. And you can think about dismemberment in many ways. The kidnapping, thingification, and the shipment of African people as slaves across the ocean, which actually affected their natality. And secondly, you can think about in terms of a continent which was partitioned into colonies. And the remembering which we're talking about here is not just about memory, but about picking the pieces for self-reconstruction. Remembering becomes a process of rehumanization. It is from this analysis, ladies and gentlemen, that we then move on to the challenges facing African studies. And the first challenge which I see is what I called the genesis and the genealogy of African studies. Critical consideration of the question of genesis and the genealogy of African studies has implications for understanding its implications within global imperial design. It also opens the potential to advance its decolonization, advance the decolonization of knowledge. For example, one can trace the genealogy of African studies, particularly if we are in the United States, and particularly if we are part of the Africanist enterprise, to the establishment of the African Studies Association in 1957 in the US, which marked the watershed in what Martin and the West termed the Africanist enterprise. But that period is the period when African studies became redefined as area studies. Adebayo Olukoshi calls this the original scene of African studies, which it has difficulty in completely shaking off. This is because the Africanist enterprise has deep roots in colonial history, and I won't go into the details of that. But what I want to suggest is that we need to revisit the genesis and the genealogies of African studies beyond what the Africanist enterprise is telling us. For instance, we can seek the genesis of African studies in Africa itself. And Ali Mazrui was the first who traced the beginning of African studies to Africa itself. He identified Egypt and the Nile Valley, where Africa's first grand civilization began, and I quote, as the birthplace of systematic study of African civilization. But we can also link the genealogy and the genesis of African studies to what Cedric Robinson termed the black radical tradition. And when we turn to Africa, we can also link the genesis of African studies to Legon in Ghana, where in 1961, Kwame Nkrumah played a major role in the establishment of the African studies. And you can actually look for the genealogies of African studies in many other areas like Dakar, Makerere, Cairo, Maputo, Lubumbashi, and the other areas. And if you do that, you will be able then to subvert the area studies problem. I've already spoken about the epistemic question as a challenge in African studies. I think the most difficult challenge in African studies. And that is the question which was posed by Mutimbe in two ways. Mutimbe posed the question this way. The first was the reality of the colonial structure of knowledge, which he termed the colonial library, which bound Africa to the West epistemically. The second was the political decolonization of Africa, which was accompanied by the search for epistemological decolonization, a struggle which has undergone resurgence and insurgence in the 21st century. Mutimbe's argument is that all the initiatives which we've taken to decolonize African studies have not been adequate to the challenge of the colonial library. For instance, he is critical of the Africanization as one of the means to liberate us epistemologically, because he says, if anything was done under African studies, the tendency was to include African productions in the existing order of knowledge. But what I want to suggest is that in order to escape the colonial library, we need to also consider other scholars, such as Dani Nabudere, who introduced the concept of Africology, and when he was seeking an African order of knowledge. You can go also to read the work of Catherine Odora Hoppers and Howard Richard, who introduced the concept of rethinking thinking as that which he aims at casting light onto the subjugated people's knowledges, histories, and ways of living. And I must end this section by actually referencing the work of Oyeronke Oyewumi, who argued that the real unmined gems are African concepts, ideas, values, and the ways of beings, and the systems of knowledge and episteme. But the other problem, I'm not sure whether it troubles you here, but where I'm based, it is a major problem. This is the problem of the theory empiricism bifurcation. And this raises the question, I see it in a practical way. I supervise a lot of doctoral and master's students in Germany. Most of them, they do their research in Africa. They come to do fieldwork in Africa, different African countries. But immediately they are challenged about theory. They look for theory in Europe and in North America. And the question which arises, is the theory European and the empiricism African? I won't answer that question, but I will pose it that way. But I must also nuance it in a particular way, because personally I was trained as a historian, so I always want to go into the periods. I must explain that in the period 1960s to 1970s, there were concerted efforts to shift the balance of power in intellectual and academic division of labor. Africa and African institutions of higher education were rebuilding themselves to simultaneously generate empirical data and formulate theory. Universities and African studies centers in Africa were attracting some of the most progressive Africanists, such as Thomas Hodgkin to Ghana, Terrace Ranger to Tanzania and to Zimbabwe. And even the famous William E.B. Du Bois moved to Ghana. Radical black scholars like Walter Rodney from Guyana also moved to Tanzania. And it was during these years of African confidence as generators of knowledge that Nkrumah developed the theory of neocolonialism. So it is not true that the Africans have not produced theories. With African economies plunging into crisis from the 1970s onwards, African studies could no longer sustain its agility to continue its own chosen trajectories. It underwent resubordination, and African studies centers in Africa were reduced, in the words of Olukoshi, to sites for collection and transmission of raw data to centers of African studies in the North. Collegial relations degenerated into clientelist modes of engagement, with the Africanists in the North bringing the money and the African scholars in Africa becoming the research assistants. I want also to demonstrate that theory is not only coming from Europe. For example, the concept of hybridity has a long genealogy in African scholarship, even though today credit is always given to Homi Bhabha. Perhaps if you want to understand the genesis of the concept of hybridity in African studies, you need to go as far back as the work of Edward Wilmot Blyden in 1887. He grappled with the question of the synthesis of African civilization and knowledge with Islamic and the Euro-Christian civilization in the making of what he termed the African personality. That same concept was picked up by Kwame Nkrumah in 1964 when he coined the concept of consciousism. And the same concept was further developed by Ali Mazrui in 1986 when he introduced the concept of the triple heritage. So you can actually have theories which are generated from Africa for your researches, for your PhDs, and for your masters. And there are many. I'm just giving two examples. But the other challenge which I see, and this one I don't even want to try to exhaust it, is the problem of what Ngoku Wathiongo described as linguistic encirclement. Linguistic encirclement is not only a consequence of colonial conquest and the imposition of colonial language. We are also complicit in the linguistic encirclement, particularly the post-colonial leaders who embraced these colonial languages and made them official languages. What is worrying is not really a romantic nationalist idea that the language came from Britain, therefore is not mine. Mine is Ndebele, therefore that's the only language which... The debates are complex, but what I always find disturbing is how Nguki's arguments about language is distorted. What is worrying is, for Nguki, is that if you take young people, disconnect them from mother tongue, and force them to learn using foreign languages, you actually plunge them into what we call stupidification of African children. That's one. Two, the normal cognitive process, we always move from the known to the unknown. You can't start from the unknown to the known. You will have disturbed the cognitive process itself. Nguki's third concern about language is that let's not take language just as a means of communication. Language is more than that. It is a carrier of a people's culture, identity, and consciousness. And the fourth concern of Nguki Wathiongo emerged within the time when we were debating intensely the issue of African Renaissance. And Nguki Wathiongo intervened and said, how could we achieve African Renaissance if the African intelligentsia, and I quote him, work outside our own linguistic memory? And within the prison house of European linguistic memory. And I must say that this linguistic encirclement has been one of the most difficult to confront and resolve, because African leaders and the majority of us, intellectuals and academics, either prefer to ignore it or to defend it using all sorts of justifications. These justifications range from the argument that Africans have effectively used imposed colonial languages to write back, that colonial languages have been useful in expression of African dreams of freedom, to that the languages are international compared to African languages that are local and too diverse. And Nguku wa Thiong'o articulated it this way: how can we resolve our present predicament, whereby considerable knowledge produced by sons and daughters of Africa is already stored in European linguistic granaries? One of the negative consequences is that many African countries, being competent, being educated, and being intelligent, is reduced to how you speak English, French, Spanish, and the other languages. The second negative consequence is that the bulk of literature written in African languages is not used to enrich African studies. The third negative consequence is that everything written in African languages is commonly pushed to departments of African languages and literature, even if the subject is philosophy or politics. How strange can it be that you go to England, all of the books written in English, they belong to the Department of Literature, English literatures. How will that work? But in Africa, I did African languages at undergraduate. It was even a very unique situation. We were reading novels written in Ndebele, in Zulu, but when it came to writing exams, we were writing in English. And Nguki raises the question that who are we writing for as African scholars? It is high time that African intellectuals and academics are called upon to account. And to account means they must answer the question, to who are they accounting to? Nguku wa Thiong'o called on African intellectuals and academics to avoid operating like outsiders in their own continent. In his recent work, which was published in 2023, he deals with the important question of translation as a language of languages. Translation is posited as an enabler not only of conversation between and across cultures, but also as a means to enhance the unity of African people. I can go on and on about this, the most difficult challenge in African studies, but the next one, maybe because I'm a historian, is the question of chronology and the periodization in African studies. This idea that everything we try to do pre-colonial, colonial, and the post-colonial, it is like the colonial actually stand like the AD and the BC. And again, it is a difficult question to deal with. Jacques Depelchin identified periodization as a silencing technology in African history, ranking alongside what he termed conceptual and a paradigmatic silencing. He argued that African history has suffered from two paradigms: the paradigm of denial of existence prior to 1960s and the paradigm of recognition after 1960s. So he says, whether you were denying it or you are recognizing, you are still silencing it. Because by the time it was accepted as a legitimate field of study, it had fitted into all European protocols of producing history, the idea and the philosophy of history. And up to now, historians have failed to come up with a clear argument whether we have an African idea of history and an African philosophy of history. And the solutions today Professor Olufem Taiwo wrote an article which a lot of people appreciated, as where he said we must do away with the pre-colonial, the idea of pre-colonial. But the problem is that he then fell into the problem of trying to say everyone was colonial. In other words, if you go as far back as Egypt, they were colonizing others. Chaka was a colonialist, Mziligas was a colonialist. If you do that, we will end up not knowing what is colonialism. Because we are using a concept transhistorically, going back and forward, without taking into account the temporalities and the variations. The other important issue, and this is controversial, is the issue of spatiality. Of course, we constantly critique area studies as carrying the colonial gene, as also serving imperial global designs. But in our practices, we seem to have fallen into that trap. South Africans researching South Africa, Zimbabweans researching Zimbabwe, Malawi is researching Malawi, and all that. In other words, we then conflict epistemological boundaries with political boundaries. And you can even fall into even a dangerous issue, what we call epistemic xenophobia. Kacheni was born in Zimbabwe, therefore he must not research South Africa. South Africa is my patch, I must only cultivate it myself. And Mamdani terms this intellectual claustrophobia. Mamdani made efforts to break from this intellectual claustrophobia through the act of historicizing geography and demonstrating the complicity of history writing with imperialism in his endeavor to denaturalize political identities. He was developing a new approach to doing African studies that is not hostage to methodological nationalism. The intellectual vistas opened by Mamdani are threefold. The first, the start of Africa that illuminates the broader questions and challenges of late modern life. A start of Africa that enables looking at the world from within Africa. And a study of Africa that avoids study of Africa by analogy. The approach where Europe is the template of what is normal and Africa provides examples of what is yet to be normal. Others think the way to resolve this issue is then to unfold or introduce what we call comparative African studies. Myself, Rutger Zisman, and Christina Vogt-William in 2022, we challenged the idea of comparative African studies. And we raised the issue that it seems to accept area studies. And what you only do, you add comparative at the beginning. Comparative area studies. It doesn't resolve the colonialities which are embedded in African studies. And at West, those who do comparative studies, they make even the worst mistake. Africa is a continent, it's not a country. You can't speak about Africa, China, Africa, a country and a continent, Brazil, Africa, India, Africa. Most of the time we are then conflating a continent with countries, and we are comparing a continent with countries, as though here in Africa, we are all the same, we speak the same languages, we live the same type of life. So we had the problems with the issue of comparative African studies. But the other important challenge in African studies is what I've called here the androcentric question in African studies. Even though there is consensus that gender is a social construct, it has successfully embedded itself in social phenomena and the conceptual and theoretical constructions. It is in this context that the challenge of androcentricity has arisen in knowledge in general and African studies in particular. This has taken the forms of ignoring and marginalizing women's contributions to society, legitimizing the subordination of women within existing male-dominated social orders, and keeping women academics and intellectual interventions and productions on the periphery of African studies. It was this realization which led Cotesria to publish a foundational volume, which I like so much, and I will actually encourage it to be a main text for reading. And that is the book entitled Engendering African Social Sciences in Africa, which was published in 1997. And in that book, 3 feminist scholars, Aisha Imam, Amina Mama, Fatou Sow, they raised a very important question. They said, if it is true that in Africa and in other parts of the world, 52% of the population is of a feminine gender, but the social sciences do not reflect that. It means that we are producing what they called a distorted and impoverished social science. So really the integration of gender analysis and the feminist theories is not to do a favor to women. It is also to improve the quality of African studies itself. I'm not sure here, where I'm based there, we have serious backlash over this. A lot of people who are in humanities, social sciences, bringing a topic for adjudication. Then you say, where is gender analysis? Where is feminist analysis? No, it does not apply to my project. It does not apply to my project. That is the answer they normally give. And when you then explain that, no, it applies this way, this way, this way, you become surprised that why is the person saying it does not apply to my project. But that is a strategy of avoiding to integrate it into the analysis of African studies and to advance the frontiers of African studies. Then, of course, quickly I will move into the problem of disciplines in African studies. What is African studies? Is it a discipline, a field of study? What is it? What is clear is that in African studies, we have a cluster of people who come from various disciplines coming into African studies and they're pretending to be doing African studies without really defining. And when you critique sometimes the limits of what they are saying, somebody begins, if it is like me, have you forgotten that I'm a historian? So the danger in African studies is that it can be orphaned any time. It can be orphaned any time. We can all withdraw to our disciplinary backgrounds whenever it becomes hot debates. We begin to say, no, as for me, I'm a linguist, don't you know that? As for me, I'm this, don't you know that? As for me, I'm this. So it's just a meeting place to pretend to be doing African studies. And then we needed to do a deeper analysis of what do we mean by African studies. Then the other problem is the problem of the canon. And I will treat this together with the problem of the colonial library, which I introduced. The novelist Toni Morrison had this to say about the canon. Canon building is empire building. Canon defense is national defense. Canon debate, whatever the terrain, nature, and the range of criticism of history, of the history of knowledge, of the definition of language, the universality of atheistic principles, the sociology of art, the humanistic imagination, is the clash of cultures, and all of the interests are vested. But in African studies, who produces what we call canonical works? And how are canonical works defined? Olukoshi wrote about the privileged non-African high priests of the discipline as the producers of African works in African studies. And those who produce the canon also work within what I will define later, which is the Africanist enterprise. And in these canonical works, other libraries are ignored. The African library, the Islamic library, which is very important also for the generation of African studies. I'm going towards the end. In the decolonial work, we are not in support of, let's remove the Eurocentric canon, let's put the Afrocentric canon. We don't work that way. We are actually against canonization of knowledge. We actually argue that knowledge is not only academic knowledge. We have everyday knowledge, we have knowledge produced from the struggle, we have indigenous knowledges. We need to bring all that into the mix so that we create what we call ecologies of knowledges. And hopefully, if we do that, then we have a richer texture of knowledge, which can take humanity out of all the problems of today. Then I will move a bit faster now, because I'm now going towards the end. With this, I could not have ended this lecture without talking about the debates, the current debates. Of course, they manifested themselves differently in different geospatial spaces. It depends where we are located, and I will talk from where I am located. Where I'm located, we have debate between what they call ideological-driven knowledge vis-a-vis scientific-driven knowledge. And that has taken us to what I called the basic epistemological questions. Questions which are not new, questions which have always been there, but which have come back to haunt us in the academy. And I will rush quickly through those questions. And I will speak also about them in the masterclass tomorrow. And we've gone back to ask ourselves, where does knowledge come from? We've come back to ask ourselves, what is the link between identity and knowledge? We've also come to ask ourselves, what is the role of experience and a biography in knowledge? Is there any role for that? What is the link between ideology and knowledge? And today you cannot ignore the other question, what is the link between technology and knowledge? So these questions, they look very straightforward. Previously, for a person like me, and Mshonga who were trained in history, one of the no-go areas, never in a historical writing say I or we. Because if you do that, that is the highest level of being subjective. The idea was that we must actually try to attain objectivity by all means. In other words, the notion of knowledge by then was that knowledge is scientific, is objective, is disembodied, is impartial, is unsituated, is detached, is universal, and truthful across space and time. With the rise of what we call the decolonial turn, there is a serious challenging of this conception of knowledge. And the idea being that nobody escapes the identities of class, sexuality, gender, spirituality, linguistics, geographical, racial hierarchies created by the modern colonial capitalist patriarchal system, even when we produce knowledge. Even when you're introducing me here, you just introduced my professional me. You did not introduce me. I'm not just a professional being. I have other many identities which I carry. And it is those identities, in fact, which actually influence what I write and what I research. Those which we decide not to talk about. Those which we, when we want to pretend to be scientific more than anybody else, we hide them. You hide race, you hide gender, you hide sexuality, you hide all this. I'm just writing. There's nothing like that. That is a lie. It is a lie which is has serious consequences. Because if you start from a lie, how are you going to arrive at the truth in the first instance? So I always say when I present my decolonial issues with my colleagues there, I say, but my only crime, which you think I'm ideological, is that I tell you the truth who I am. And I put my identities on the table. I put all of the factors which actually influence why I write the way I write, why I choose these topics rather than other topics. And I don't believe that there is an agendaless knowledge. There's nothing like that. All knowledge is have a particular agenda. It's only that it is hidden. So we need to go back to those issues. And you will find that post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, has given us so many other concepts which we can work with in order to challenge these conceptions of knowledge. The idea that knowledge is situated, the idea that knowledge has a geography, the geopolitics of knowledge, the idea that in knowledge there is eco-politics, the idea that knowledge is embodied. All that challenges this idea of attainment, of pretending to be scientific, and you ignore where you are standing, you ignore your identities which you carry. After all, even when we write books, even if we hide our identities, when we take them for publication, we need to write Sabelo Jailo Vukacheni outside. We need to identify yourself. Then the other challenge which is emerging, I'm not sure here, but I think it has actually reared its ugly head here, is this issue of what we call colonial revisionism. Here, I think it started with what is her name, the leader of the DA, who was saying colonialism it had good consequences. She is not the only one. Bruce Giles wrote an article defending colonialism and even arguing that there is need for recolonization of Africa. Nigel Baker wrote a book, Colonialism, a Reckoning, where he argued that we need a balanced sheet, balanced view of colonial history, and even we need to study ethics of the empire. The interesting part about this type of work, and I'm reading it now very closely, is that it then says those who push the decolonial agenda, they are stuck in history. They are stuck in generalizations. These are people who are about provoking white guilty, people pursuing politics of victimhood, and the people who are ignoring African agents. But if you read their works, they are even more selective in what they present as evidence than even the decolonial scholars. When they justify colonialism and they say colonialism was in fact against slavery. And the example of South Africa is given that it was actually the colonial empire which ended the slavery. It was actually the colonial empire which introduced the liberalism. That's what they will tell you. But in the decolonial work, we've actually emphasized more on the issue of the epistemic, the cognitive empire, how colonialism was underpinned by a cognitive empire, which invades the mental universe of other people in order to introduce particular knowledges and to cultivate particular forms of consciousness. Then the other important issue which is haunting African studies, I'm not sure here, when I was even here at the University of South Africa, it was beginning to actually affect the decolonial work. And that was the attempt to create conflict between decolonial scholars and the Marxist scholars. The idea that decolonial scholars are dismissing Marxism very easily and they're saying it is a Eurocentric thought. I don't think we are so simplistic. we actually know that Marxism has been one of the most traveled theory that has not been embraced by African scholars, but also it was stretched to make it relevant in different contexts. It was that reality which made me and Mokendlovu to write that book, Marxism and the Decolonization. And in that book, our argument is that there has always been complementarity between decolonization and Marxism, rather than the conflicts which people are trying to create. And this is why you will find that even in the black radical tradition, there is the concept of black Marxism, that they are black Marxists. The other problem about this debate is that there is deliberate conflation of decoloniality with the post-coloniality, with this post-structuralism, with the post-modernism, to the extent that if you conflate them like that, you say their crisis is that they are all driven by what is called the cultural turn in knowledge production. And that cultural turn, therefore, made us to drop the material question and run with the epistemic question. I don't think that is also very true. And the debate also goes like this. What must frame the other? Prashad says decoloniality must be framed by Marxism if it is to maintain its revolutionary cutting edge. But if you read Zeleza, he argues that, and I need to quote him here, nationalist humanism has withstood new theoretical waves that have arisen from time to time and alleged against its static foundations, more than not new ideas and ideologies from Marxism to dependency to feminism to post have been incorporated into the trappings, spacious complex of African nationalist humanism. In other words, the African nationalist thought actually frames Marxism. I don't want to resolve that, but I wanted to share with you this view. But the beauty of it is that at the moment there is resurgent decolonization, which we call decoloniality, but there is also resurgent democratic Marxism, which both are actually contributing very positively to the advancement of African studies. I think I've already spoken about the hegemony of the African enterprise. By this we mean the dominance in African studies by Africanists, and by Africanists we mean those who are based in North America, in Europe, who are not necessarily Africans, but they've made careers researching Africa. And we call it an enterprise because it is well-funded. It is supported by some of the top journals and the presses. And because of that, it tends to determine the trajectory of African studies. If you publish your book with the OSCE or something here, after all, it will be known by you only. And in the Africanist enterprise, if you go to 1958, when Melville Herskovits became the first president of the African Studies Association of the United States, he wrote a short paper where he argued that Africanists will do better scholarship in African studies. Guess what was the reason? He actually said Africanists, not all of them, but especially those from the United States. And they said they will do better scholarship, scientific objective scholarship, because the United States had no colonies. So there is no interest. They don't have this other package of colonialism and other things. And he said, secondly, they will be objective and scientific because of the distance from what they are studying. The major problem about Savelo, Mshonga, and the others, too close to what we are studying, to the extent that you can't really be objective, you are always subjective. That is the argument which he presented. But I want to also show that this question is still troubling us in African studies to the extent that in 2013, October 2013, African scholars gathered in Accra, in Ghana, and they established what is called the African Studies Association of Africa. Within a context in which the strongest, most attended African studies associations are in Europe and North America. And if you want to be recognized, taken seriously, you must make a trek every year to those conferences, which are happening outside the continent. This is why we have a problem with the Africanist enterprise and how it drives the African Studies project. And at the university where I'm based, there was an agreement that it is indeed a problem. And there was an agreement that we needed to make concerted effort to subvert it. Hence, our Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, the overarching objective is reconfiguring African studies. We are trying to reconfigure African studies at two levels, conceptually and structurally. Structurally, we actually established 4, if not 5, African cluster centers on the continent. One in Lagos, another one in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, another one in Eldoret in Kenya, and another one in Makanda here in South Africa. And the attempt was that we needed to do African studies with the Africans and the African scholars. But the money comes from the German, the DFG. It comes from Germany. We give them the budgets, of course, but they have to account to the center. So it's a very difficult terrain to maneuver. And this also links with what I've called the coloniality of the global economy of knowledge. And I don't want to waste most of the time there. You all know, where do you publish your work? Why do you publish it where you publish it? Why do you use the languages which you are using to publish in those journals? And why is it that even if you are rejected, you continue publishing there? The problem is that there are power hierarchies. If you want to be called international scholar, you need to do that. Even if they are kicking you outside, you must always push your head inside. And that is a major problem which Shose Kesi, Zoe Max, Elelwane Ramagundu in 2020 captured as the challenge of structural decolonizing of African studies, which takes the form, and I quote, redistributing, opening material resources and opportunities, institutions, job titles, professional recognition, research budgets, leadership, gatekeeping roles, scholarship, and entry admission that are certainly distributed in ways that echo and reproduce colonial relations. And then the last part of this challenge, how do we write about Africa? That is a long-standing question, and it is actually part of the battle of ideas in African studies. The central dispute being, who writes about Africa? What is written about Africa? How is Africa interpreted and represented? And you remember Achille Mbembe, when he had problems with the colleagues in Contestations, he wrote that article, African Modes of Self-Writing, which was very critical of the way we write about ourselves. But he never told us who should write about us. And this problem also arises within a context where stereotypes and the pathologizing narratives still dominate. And it was this drive to change the narrative about Africa which provoked Binya Vanga Wainaina to write a satirical work entitled How to Write About Africa in 2022. And I would recommend the reading of that book. And it is in the same spirit that drove Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie to entitle her 2009 TED global speech, The Danger of a Single Story. There is a strong discourse which poses that Africa is not a country, and we need to write about it within the. And I want to conclude by saying, what then is the future? I won't spend a lot of time on that. Having said all what I've said, how are we going to conceive African studies? A colleague from School of Oriental Studies were together in a panel at University of Ottawa in Canada. She said we must abolish African studies. Do you agree with that? Then there are others who are saying we need to engage in comparative African studies. And I've already critiqued that. Then we have others, particularly Ishose Kesi, Ramagondo, and Marx. They introduced and they argued strongly for what they called critical African studies. Then there are others who are building on the work of the Cameroonian sociologist, anthropologist, Francis Nyamjo, and they are proposing what is called frontier African studies. Then there are others who are saying, since we are now spread all over the world, we are no longer confined to the continent. We have Africans everywhere. I think African studies must actually assume the title of global African studies. And there you need to be careful. You need not to push the idea of global African studies because of the global 10. You need to push the issue of global African studies because of the planetary spread of Africans across the world. And you need to be careful because if you push it in terms of the global 10, you will fall into other problems. I think I must stop here. I'm thankful that my voice really sustained. I never thought it was going to do this. Thank you so much.
I honestly don't know whether to thank Professor Sabelo Gacheni for asking me to be his discussant, because what he has done is to give us an atlas which is masquerading as a lecture. And this is very difficult for me. Notwithstanding the fact that I had the opportunity to receive the lecture in time and to study it closely. But now when he presented, he turned everything upside down. But I will try and see what I can salvage from this as a discussant. And I also try and highlight a few key aspects or issues that he has introduced. And obviously, you will all agree with me that it will not be possible to scan the entire map that he has given us. So allow me to ask the question, so where do I begin to respond or to discuss this lecture? Well, I want to begin with one particular scholar, the Iranian scholar, Ahmed Dabash, who has a book that goes by the title, Can Non-Europeans Think? And if you want a short answer to that precise and tormenting question, the answer is there. And allow me to say that Ahmed Dabash goes further in his tour de force, Can Non-Europeans Think, and ask a sub-question. What happens to those non-Europeans who operate outside the European philosophical pedigree, like him? And his answer is, they are invariably marginalized, they are invariably misrepresented, they are invariably disparaged. And so I think from the map that he has given us, I think we have seen that. And walk with me to the University of Zimbabwe, and the year is 1991. And the venue is a history seminar room where an honors student was going to defend his honors dissertation before a history departmental panel. The protagonist was a renowned professor of history who came dissenting on this student with a ton of questions and millions of questions in order to confuse the student, poking holes into his work, dismissing his thesis, and ending by giving him a very ugly mark. This is very interesting. Fast forward 20 years into the independence of Zimbabwe, and for your information, Zimbabwe got its independence in 1980. So for over 20 years, the history department at the University of Zimbabwe never produced a PhD student, okay? But that record, interestingly enough, was broken by this student who was disparaged, who was misrepresented, whose work was poked by this professor, when he became the first student to graduate with a PhD in history. And interestingly, in that seminar, when a lot of difficult and tormenting questions were thrown at him, he remained calm, composed, and calculated in his responses. And he was able, definitely, thanks to the power of decolonial love, to avoid blood on the floor of the seminar room. And as I have already said, 20 years, none had graduated, no single black Zimbabwean student had graduated with a PhD. But what is interesting is that that same student is today a leading scholar in epistemologies of the Global South. He is a leading scholar in asking us to do knowledge at the planetary level. And that student is actually today a polymath, of knowledge, if I can put it that way. And that student frustrates many people, including myself. Before you finish reading his latest publication, another one, if not two, if not three, if not 10, are already out. And that student is in this room today. And that student is Professor Sabelo J. Ndlovu Kacheni. So what is the message that this student has brought us today and to share with us today during the moment of Heritage Month in this beautiful rainbow nation? This is the question that I pose. I think what this student is saying to us is, let us claim and own African studies. Let us do African studies with Africans in order to grow the African idea of Africa in African studies. I hope that message is clear. This is what I have gleaned. And obviously, doing African studies with Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, will be able to nurture that African idea of Africa and will enable us to exercise the ghost of coloniality that we find in African studies and in African knowledges in general. And also interestingly is to say that to do that and to do African studies with Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, is very enriching in trying to confront and to disrupt a very dangerous empire that has remained intact on this continent, despite the fact that the physical empire had withdrawn. But a particular empire remained, and that is the cognitive empire. A very dangerous empire, an intimate empire, an enemy empire, the empire in me, the empire with us, the empire is us. And that empire has to be disrupted. I think this is one of the messages that we glean from Professor Sabelo J. Ndlovu Gacheni. And to do African studies with Africans also means the exorcism of the gaze of the other, which has always been and which has always seen Africa as a land of childhood. Allow me just to call him Sabelo. That's how we call each other. So allow me to call him Sabelo, because if I want to call his entire full name, it will eat a few seconds. So Sabelo has actually told us that it is possible to reworld the world from Africa and to reworld the world from the global south. He has also demonstrated the feasibility of doing African studies with Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora, by scanning through those 4 futures which he left hanging. But in my view, I think what he was saying was that an eclecticism of comparative African studies, critical African studies, frontier African studies, and global African studies can enrich and engender this African idea of Africa in African studies and in knowledge domains. Thank you, Professor Sabelo, for also addressing the other tormenting question and what I call matters arising in African studies. Because, namely, this idea that, is there any justification and is there any utility of having African studies in Africa? I think he spoke to that. And thank you for answering that, because I have been confronted by many fellow African scholars who often ask me, why do we have a center for gender and Africa in Africa for African studies? Very difficult question, but I think he has addressed that. And obviously, if you did not get it, the idea is to grow the African idea of Africa with Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora. And as I have already said, Prof. Sabelo, thank you for sharing this lecture in advance, because I had ample time to study it deeply and closely. And I was struck by one thing. And that one thing is that, unlike many historians I know, including this one, you are not allergic to figures. I was able to notice that you weaved your lecture around a complex mathematical model or mathematical series, that reads 9, 10, 6, and 4. And this is what I saw as you went through your lecture. In the first section, 9, in the second section, 10, in the third section, 6, and in the last section, 4, and giving us that complex mathematical formula. So allow me to seek, permission from the beautiful sovereign people in this house and online, whether we should name this complex mathematical formula the Ndlovu-Gacheni mathematical series, or should we call it resolution 91064? Which is which? I'm seeking your permission, ladies and gentlemen. Resolution, okay, thank you. Prof, whether you like it or not, it has been named resolution 91064. So if I stray and call it the Ndlovu-Gacheni mathematical series, you must chop my head. All right, and so, ladies and gentlemen, on the basis of this, I will pick a few issues which, from each section, that I will unpack for you as your discussant, but obviously I know you have already forgiven me if I don't do a good job, because the lecture is so complex. In fact, it's not a lecture, it's an atlas. But one of the most difficult and tormenting questions which he has already raised has to do with the idea of the existence of the black person in the world. But we don't stop there, and he didn't stop there. He also had to talk about the re-existence of the black person in the world. And if I remember very well, Dr. Stephanie Kewood, probably 11 years ago, in this room, we had a renowned scholar by the name Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who gave a lecture titled Africa and the World, I think, with a subtitle, The Blackness of Black. And related to the tormenting questions that you ask is this whole idea that having been expelled from history, having been expelled from your culture, having been expelled from your language, we live in what I have read in some of his works as ontological exilement. And once you have been put into that ontological exilement, it naturally translates into epistemic exilement. And it simply means that you don't have epistemic virtue. And this is the reason why our Steve Bantu Biko had to write, I write what I like, because he had been expelled from having epistemic virtue. And Prof addressed a number of difficult questions in the first question, in the first section, but I will simply summarize them this way in terms of the existence and our desired re-existence of the black person in the world. That is, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the question was, are you human beings? And this is the question that an Italian dreamer, Christopher Columbus, posed to people who came to greet him when he stepped out of a ship in the Americas in 1492. Are you human beings? Do you have a soul? A question that naturally and in the end condemned millions of Africans into servitude, into slavery, and into enslavement. Move forward to the 16th and to the 17th century. This is where we have a one René Descartes, who is celebrated as the father of Western philosophy. Do they think? Do black people think? And obviously, that thing is summarized in René si cogito ego sum. I think, therefore I am. But remember, that I cannot be appropriated by you and me and anyone. It is for someone who lives in a cloud with a God complex kind of epistemology. And I think Prof has kind of taken us that route. And then move forward. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the question was, do they have history? He has shown us that. Do they have development? Because to have history and to have development, you must have ruins. And this is where G.W. Hegel comes in with his idea that Africa is not a historical continent. It shows neither development nor change. And fast forward, 1961, University of Oxford, a one Hugh Trevor Roper is asked by one of his students, Prof, what about African history? And Hugh Trevor Roper simply said to him, there is no African history to talk about. Maybe in the future. At the moment, it is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. Fast forward, 20th century, do they have development? Do they have human rights? And fast forward, 21st century, do black people have ethics? So it all comes up to what one can call an epochal question. In this epoch, it is this question. In that epoch, it is that question. And in that epoch, it is this question. And on and on and on. And this is why then we then had actual movements like, as he has already shared, the black radical tradition with the idea of the black radical emancipation calling for existence and engendering philosophical trends and movements like Ethiopianism, Gaveism, Pan-Africanism, and fast forward, your roads must fall, fees must fall, and Black Lives Matter movements. They are all movements for the re-existence of the black person in this world, okay? And this is about the remembering, not remembering, remembering, the reconstitution, okay? And the reparative, as he has already said, of the destituted in order to engender freedom dreams. Fast forward to the second part of his lecture, with that configuration, here Prof. Ndlovu-Gacheni delineated those challenges as 10 and called for efforts to reform, if not to decolonize, the African studies field and knowledge in general. And what he has demonstrated was probably the stillbirth of African studies, whose umbilical cord was dropped in a foreign land in the United States of America in 1957, and what Adebayo Olukushi called the original sin. So exactly calling us again to say, we must come back and try and do African studies with Africans in order to engender the African idea of Africa. And that is why a group of African students, I think 3 black women, who found themselves studying at SOAS, that is in London, that is the School of Oriental and African Studies, simply said, and I quote, "There is no Africa in African studies." I think it summarizes that. And so this calls not only for the exorcism of coloniality in African studies, and in African knowledge, but also for the dethroning of the Africanist enterprise with its race poison. And this is where the various schools, like the Dhaka school, the Ibadan school, and the Dar es Salaam school, and many others made tremendous interventions. And one major challenge that Professor Ndlovu Gacheni deposited in our space has to do with this theory, empiricism, bifurcation, where in the European, in the Euro-American academy, it is universality is claimed for the disciplines and contextuality for area or African studies. And this is a very silly notion, if I can put it that way. And also this whole idea that, the disciplines are a preserve of the West, and Africa or area studies is for the rest, or for the Western world, if you want. And this is the context in which, a memo which was coined in Nairobi called the Nairobi Memo of 1968-1969, asking, and I quote, "Why can't Africa be at the center so that we can view other cultures in relation to it?" Prof. Ndlovu Gacheni has challenged us to be brave enough to formulate theory and concept informed by our work, rather than living our entire lives applying theories and models developed elsewhere. We were also cautioned in this lecture against the naturalization and normalization of the use of colonial languages, and to suggest that it is very possible to raise African languages to the same philosophical level as French, as English, as Portuguese, and any other language for that matter. And please, in advance, I want to request that if I sound blasphemous, please forgive me. If it was possible to translate the Bible into every language, why is it not possible to translate all these scientific articles, all these scientific books into African languages? It's a question that I will not be able to answer, but it is for you to ponder over. Prof also cautioned us, and some of us absolutely do that, to talk and think about Africa as if Africa is a country. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent of 54 sovereign states or entities. So let us resist that attempt. Allow me, as I move towards trying to wrap up, to say that one of the very important things that Prof. Gacheni has deposited into our space to ponder seriously is the erasure of women in history and in knowledge production. And it is this idea of seeing Africa as a country that is naturally led to the erasure of women in history and in knowledge-producing centers. Prof. Ndlovu Gacheni did his best to exorcise the ghost of androcentricity in African knowledge generation by outlining some of the tremendous efforts that have already been made and that are still going, and in trying to recover the voices of women, Gayatri Spivak, cis-sexed subaltern subjects. Professor Ndlovu also made a very compelling case for African feminist scholarship, which is fighting hard to liberate itself from the suffocating tendencies of imperial feminism and missionary feminism. Check what that means. And as well as, obviously, to liberate African feminist scholarship from the patriarchal, prison house to which women were condemned since the fourth genocide that was committed in Al-Andalus in the 15th century, where thinking women were women who had high knowledge about cosmology, about ethics, about everything else, healing strategies and the like, were burned on the stake, being accused of being witches. Ladies and gentlemen, this problem is still with us today. We still accuse our women today as witches. We still accuse them and burn them on stakes through gender-based violence and femicide, chopping their bodies and putting them into bags. Is that not the same as the 14th, 15th century? And even in this very 21st century, one very worrying thing which still persists is this whole idea of looking at thinking women, those women who are thinking, as not the ideal type of women, and then categorizing them or labeling them as bitches. Ladies and gentlemen, mainstreaming African gender or women studies and gendering African studies will go a long way in undoing both the local and global gender hierarchies that privilege males over females and Europeans over non-Europeans. That is why at UFS we have a center called the Center for Gender and Africa Studies to do precisely that, but it is for you to judge to what extent are we successful. Yet, those of us in Africa or African studies are confronted with numerous problems. He has already talked about the disciplinary versus interdisciplinarity debate. In SIGAS, obviously, we pride ourselves, as being a house of many mansions. As we draw from history, from political science, from international relations, from media studies, from education, and across the terrain. And yet, one of the downsides of that is that academics who live and cross boundaries, as some of us have already done, face the risk of being expelled from our disciplines where we come from. Prof has already alluded that. And I hope, Dr. Masakure, you are not going to expel me from history. I will beg you beyond measure. And also being intellectually homeless. These are some of the challenges that are there. Because academic tribalism is a reality in the world of academia. And yet, on the other side, this does not mean to say fruitful conversations cannot happen across disciplines and between disciplines. There are so fertile trading zones at the fringes in which pigeonization and creolization can emerge. Paul Tiambe Zeleza always talks of or tells us that despite the passions with which disciplines and interdisciplines, despite the passions in which gatekeepers, fight very hard to keep their disciplines, there is always exchange of information, theories, methodologies, and approaches. So there is borrowing from and across disciplines. And I personally enjoy operating at the margins and borrowing from everywhere to flavor my work, even if it means borrowing from physics and biology. You can imagine. But I'm also proud to say that I know colleagues who are also borrowing a lot from other different disciplines and to flavor their work. And Dr. Stephanie Kewood, Professor Haid Hudson are some of the people that I'm familiar with their work. But also from a student's point of view, I think the interdisciplinarity is a great opportunity to liberate oneself from disciplinary parochialism and narrow-mindedness. Yet, the downsides of that could be diminished employment opportunities in a global economy that operates along compartmentalized professions. So these observations, among others, ladies and gentlemen, I think led Professor Ndlovu to conclude that, and I quote, appeals to inter, trans, and multidisciplinarity have so far failed to enable a reconfiguration of African studies into a cohesive, discursive, and epistemological field. Therefore, it is too soon, ladies and gentlemen, to declare the end of disciplines, but it is also too soon to celebrate the long life of disciplines, as some of them will soon wither away. Prof. Ndlovu Gacheni is also demonstrated beyond measure in terms of the so-called canon and colonial library, both of which rely not only on two sources of knowledge, especially in Eurocentric epistemology, that is observation and reasoning. He has amply demonstrated that there are other multiple sources of knowledge like social interaction, cosmology, ritual archives, autoethnography, and many others. So Prof. Ndlovu is also demonstrated in his final kind of section this whole idea of the tormenting epistemological questions, which appear as if they are new questions, and yet these are all the basic questions that continue to hound us. I'm not going to repeat that, but I'm just going to say, in this case, I wanted to invert Michel Foucault's dictum that that power is everywhere because it comes from everywhere. And the way I want to invert it is to say knowledge is everywhere because it comes from everywhere. And Professor Ndlovu Gacheni demonstrated that. After all, ladies and gentlemen, all living things need to know in order to live, and they need to live in order to know. For without knowing, there is no living, and without living, there is no knowing. That is paramount. So, Prof. Ndlovu, thank you very much for giving us this atlas and even telling us, and in terms of the rise of right-wing revisionist scholarship, but which I think we can all confront if we do African studies with Africans, both on the continent and in the diaspora. And I think one of the important things that Prof successfully did here, before I say thank you, is that he has exposed this so-called and how he has exposed how the touted global economy of knowledge through calls for internationalization of higher education are nothing but phallic erections of the resilient cognitive empire, which is seeking to complete the incomplete project of modernity. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say in short, I can say Prof. Gacheni has successfully dealt with competing versions of being in the world. And allow me to quote a one Mao Zedong. There is turmoil in the world of letters, and the prospects are excellent, declares Mao Zedong. Yes, there is turmoil, but Prof. Gacheni showed us that and showed us how to exit the existential, epistemic prison. And he used African history and African studies, as we call African history, as we call it on this side of the Atlantic, to demonstrate that there is a lot of colonial nonsense that we need to unlearn in order to relearn across all disciplines and in all fields of knowledge: health science, economics, mathematics, biology, physics, you name it. And Prof. Sevius Guriro, where are you? Okay. Any mathematician here, I would have wanted him to tell me that in a mathematical series that I wanted to name, I think there is no end. And I wanted him to declare that because there is no end, I should also end right away. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Mashonga, there might be no end, but I will have to end the program tonight with a brief vote of thanks. So there are many people that go into arranging such an event. But before we get to that, I would like to invite all guests to a small reception in the foyer afterward. But let's thank the people who made tonight possible. First and foremost, our speaker tonight, Professor Sabelo Gacheni, for his profound and provocative lecture. So he traveled all the way from Germany to be with us tonight, even though he's not completely 100%. And we appreciate that enormously. And moreover, thank you for reminding us that as scholars and students, we have to engage with the politics of knowledge production. In other words, not just about making new knowledge, but also how we make that new knowledge. Then I would like to thank Professor Mogomi Masoga, Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities, for opening the program tonight. Our heartfelt thanks for supporting the Centre's activities in this way. Thanks, Prof. To Dr. Munyaradzi Mashonga, Program Director for the Africa Studies Program, and also Professor Sabelo's praise singer in his free time. Thank you for your role tonight, but also thank you for being the convener of the steering committee for this event. As always, my deepest gratitude to all the staff in the Centre for all the logistical arrangements behind the scenes, particularly in this case, Portia Galele and Ankia Bradfield. Thank you for all your efforts in this regards. We see you. So last but not least, to our audience tonight, both in person and virtual, thank you for joining us. We know it's a difficult time of year. People have things to do. They're looking toward the end of the year, so we appreciate your presence enormously. To those who are able, as I've said, please stay and enjoy the reception with us, but please remain seated while the speaker and the procession leave the room first. Thank you.